The buzzing of my phone shattered the quiet of the evening. I glanced at the screen. Julia. A name I hadn't seen in a decade. My stomach churned. Memories flooded back. Memories I'd buried under layers of bitterness and time. I let it ring, unsure if I wanted to open that door again. But something about seeing her name, a ghost from a life I thought was over, drew me in. Against my better judgment, I answered. Evan? Her voice cracked, sounding smaller, more fragile than I remembered. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to talk to you. It's about that night, about us. I froze. That night. She didn't have to specify which one. The night I caught her with someone else. My hands tightened around the phone as anger bubbled up, a visceral reaction to wounds I thought had healed. Why now, Julia? Why after all these years? Her silence stretched across the line. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, Because I lied to you, Evan. It wasn't what you thought. I can't explain over the phone. Please, can we meet? Part of me wanted to hang up, slam the door shut once and for all. But curiosity clawed at me. I had questions that had haunted me for years, questions I'd tried to drown in whiskey and meaningless distractions. Why did she do it? Did she ever regret it? And now, what was she hiding? I agreed to meet, against my better judgment. My heart pounded as I hung up. What was I walking into? The woman I had loved, the woman who had destroyed me, wanted back into my life. And I was about to let her. I remember that night with agonizing clarity, as if my mind had replayed it on a loop for years. 10 years ago, my world imploded in a single instant. Julia and I were hosting a small dinner party at our home in Boston. We had been married for 5 years at that point, and to everyone around us, we were the perfect couple. But the truth was, cracks had started forming months earlier, subtle, nearly invisible. At the time, I convinced myself it was just the stress of life. I never imagined it was something much deeper. Among our guests that evening was Mark, my best friend since college. He was charming, always quick with a joke, and one of the few people I trusted implicitly. Julia and he got along well, but I never thought much of it. She was warm and kind, the sort of person who made everyone feel at ease. That's just who she was, or so I thought. As the night went on, I noticed something odd. Julia and Mark were exchanging glances, subtle but unmistakable. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Paranoia, I thought. But as the evening stretched on, the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Every stolen look, every shared laugh, they felt like daggers to my chest. At some point, I left the room to get more wine. When I returned, Julia and Mark were gone. My heart raced as I searched the house. The hallway felt endless, the shadows too quiet. Then I heard it, muffled voices from our bedroom. I froze outside the door, my mind screaming at me to walk away. But something stronger, pride, anger, desperation, drove me to turn the handle. What I saw destroyed me. Julia stood too close to Mark, her hand resting on his chest. The air between them crackled with intimacy. It was clear that this wasn't the first time. I didn't wait for an explanation. I didn't want one. Rage boiled over, and I shouted words I can barely remember. Julia tried to speak, but her voice drowned under the roar of my betrayal. Mark slipped out of the room like a coward, leaving Julia and me alone in the wreckage. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached for me, but I backed away as if her touch burned. Don't, I spat. Don't you dare try to explain this. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't care where I went. I just knew I couldn't stay. The trust we'd built, the love we'd shared, it was all gone, shattered like glass on the floor. For weeks, Julia tried to reach me. She left voicemails, sent letters, even came by my office. I ignored it all. To me, she was dead. And for 10 years, I lived as though she were, burying the pain deep enough to forget. Until now. After that night, I left Boston and started over in Chicago. The city was cold, impersonal, a perfect backdrop for disappearing. I traded the familiar for the unfamiliar, cutting ties with everyone who knew me before. No more mutual friends, no more shared memories. It was my way of ensuring Julia's shadow wouldn't follow me. I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors nod but don't pry. The first few months were a blur. I drowned myself in work, taking on every project that came my way. Late nights at the office turned into early mornings, and I convinced myself I was moving forward. But the truth was I was running from the image of Julia's hand on Mark's chest, from the sound of her pleading voice echoing in my head. There were moments, though, when the past broke through. A song on the radio, the smell of her favorite perfume on a stranger, or a passing glimpse of a couple holding hands. Those moments were the hardest. They reminded me of the life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared. For a long time, I hated her for ruining it. But in the quietest hours of the night, I hated myself more, for not seeing it coming. Eventually, I tried dating again. There was Lauren, a schoolteacher with a laugh that reminded me of Julia's. Then Sarah, who was fun and spontaneous, the complete opposite. But every time I got close, the scars resurfaced. Trust felt like a foreign language I could no longer speak. It wasn't their fault. It was mine. Julia had taken that part of me with her, and I didn't know how to get it back. My career flourished in the meantime. Promotions, accolades, respect. I had it all. On the surface, I was thriving. Colleagues saw me as focused and driven, someone who had his life together. But beneath the surface, I felt hollow. Success was a mask I wore, hiding the emptiness I carried inside. Mark, too, faded into obscurity. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved to another state. I never sought him out, never wanted to hear his side of the story. In my mind, he was a traitor, no different from Julia. Whatever friendship we had died the moment I saw them together. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need closure, didn't need answers. The past was the past, and I was done with it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I carried that night with me everywhere, like a phantom that refused to be exorcised. 10 years passed this way, a decade of pretending I'd moved on, convincing myself I was better off without her. And then, in the span of one phone call, Julia pulled me back into the life I'd tried so hard to leave behind. The question I'd avoided for years resurfaced, louder than ever. What really happened that night? The coffee shop she chose was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from prying eyes. I arrived early, nervous energy driving me to pace the sidewalk before finally stepping inside. The place was small, dimly lit, with the kind of generic charm meant to make patrons feel at ease. I felt anything but. She walked in 5 minutes late, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. Julia looked different, thinner, more tired. Her dark hair, once vibrant and full of life, was tied back loosely, streaked with gray that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same, wide and piercing. They met mine across the room, and I felt an old, familiar ache in my chest. "Evan," she said softly, as if testing the weight of my name. I nodded, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Julia." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, while I stared into my untouched cup of coffee. The silence was heavy, filled with years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. "You look good," she offered awkwardly. I didn't return the compliment. Instead, I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest. "Why am I here, Julia? What do you want from me?" Her face fell, and she glanced down at her hands. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "There's so much I need to tell you. Things I should have told you back then." "Start with the truth," I said coldly. "Something you've never been good at." She flinched at my words, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I buried it quickly. I needed answers, not apologies. "Evan, that night, what you saw, it wasn't what you think," she began, her voice trembling. I laughed bitterly. "Oh, really?" Because it seemed pretty clear to me. "You and Mark." "It wasn't an affair," she interrupted, her words tumbling out in a rush. "At least not in the way you think." She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. "I need you to hear me out before you make up your mind." I didn't trust her, but curiosity had always been my weakness. "Fine," I said, leaning forward. "Talk." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if holding on for dear life. Mark and I, it was a mistake, but it wasn't about love or attraction. It was about survival. Survival, I repeated, disbelief thick in my voice. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Evan, there were things going on in my life that I never told you about. Things that would have put you in danger if I'd involved you. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. This wasn't the explanation I'd expected. What are you talking about? Do you remember my brother, Eric? She asked. I frowned, the name stirring faint memories. Eric had always been the black sheep of her family, in and out of trouble. What about him? She swallowed hard. He got involved with the wrong people. Dangerous people. They came after him, and when he couldn't pay his debts, they came after me. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt my stomach drop. What does this have to do with Mark? She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. They gave me an ultimatum. Do what they wanted or they'd hurt you. Mark, he was supposed to help me. But things got out of control. I stared at her, my mind racing. Was this another lie? Another excuse? Or was it the truth I'd been searching for all these years? As I watched her struggle to hold back tears, I realized I didn't know the answer. But one thing was clear. Whatever Julia had been hiding, it wasn't over. And now I was being dragged back into the nightmare I thought I'd escaped. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. Julia's words echoed in my mind, tangling with memories and doubts I couldn't shake. It wasn't what you thought. Mark was supposed to help me. They would have hurt you. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it all as another one of her manipulations. She'd lied before. What stopped her from lying now? But something about the look in her eyes, the tremor in her voice, felt different, genuine, and that terrified me more than the possibility of deceit. Once home, I sat in the dark, replaying our conversation. She hadn't given me specifics, no names, no clear timeline, just fragments of a story that made no sense. What kind of danger? Why involve Mark? And why now, after 10 years, was she telling me this? Sleep was impossible. My mind refused to settle, churning through every interaction, every moment I'd shared with her and Mark. Were there signs I'd missed? Warnings I hadn't heeded? I poured a drink, hoping to quiet the storm, but it only fueled my frustration. The next morning, I made a decision. If Julia wouldn't give me the answers I needed, I'd find them myself. I started with the one name she'd mentioned, Eric. Her brother had always been trouble, but he'd been out of the picture long before our marriage fell apart. I hadn't thought about him in years. A quick online search revealed little. No social media presence, no recent records. It was as if he'd disappeared. I called a mutual acquaintance, someone who had known Julia's family back in Boston. Eric? They said, their voice laced with unease. He got himself into some bad stuff a while back. Drugs, I think. Last I heard, he was running with some shady people in New York. Why do you ask? Just curious. I lied. If Eric was mixed up with dangerous people, Julia's story started to make sense. But that still didn't explain Mark. Why would she turn to him for help? And what did he get out of it? I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was the key to all of this. The last time I'd seen him was that night, slipping out of my bedroom like a thief in the dark. I had no idea where he was now, but I was determined to find out. Digging into his life wasn't easy. He'd left Boston shortly after everything fell apart, and none of our mutual friends had heard from him since. But persistence paid off. After hours of searching, I found a lead, a small law firm in Providence where he was listed as a junior partner. I hesitated before calling. What would I even say? Accuse him of being part of some twisted scheme? Demand answers he probably wouldn't give? But curiosity outweighed my pride. I dialed the number and waited. When he picked up, his voice was the same as I remembered. Smooth, confident, with just a hint of arrogance. This is Mark. Mark, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. It's Evan. There was a long pause. Evan, he said slowly, as if testing the weight of my name. This is unexpected. We need to talk, I said. In person. Another pause, and then he sighed. All right, but if this is about Julia. It's always been about Julia, I snapped. We agreed to meet later that week. As I hung up, a sense of unease settled over me. The past was unraveling, dragging me back to places I'd long tried to forget, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Mark chose a trendy bar in downtown Providence for our meeting, the kind of place where people went to be seen. It was loud, bustling, and impersonal, a stark contrast to the quiet storm brewing inside me. I spotted him immediately, seated in a booth at the back, nursing a whiskey. He hadn't changed much in 10 years. A few gray hairs around the temples, perhaps, but the same sharp suit, the same practiced smile that once made him so easy to trust. Evan, he said, standing as I approached. He extended a hand, but I ignored it, sliding into the booth across from him. Mark, I said curtly. His smile faltered, and he sat back down. I take it this isn't a social call. You're not exactly someone I'd call for a drink, I shot back. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Fair enough. So, what's this about? It's about Julia, I said, watching his reaction closely. His face remained impassive, but I caught the slight twitch of his jaw. What about her? He asked carefully. I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. She told me a story about that night, about you, and about some danger she was in. I want to know if it's true. Mark took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. And why should I tell you anything? Because I deserve the truth, I said. Something neither of you gave me back then. He sighed, setting his glass down. You really want to dig this up after all these years? What good will it do you? I'm not leaving here without answers, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment he said nothing, staring at his drink as if searching for the right words. Then he looked up, his expression uncharacteristically serious. All right, Evan, you want the truth? Fine, but you're not going to like it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Julia wasn't lying about Eric. The guy was in deep gambling debts, drugs, you name it, and the people he owed weren't the kind you could just pay off and walk away from. They wanted control. They wanted leverage. I frowned, my mind racing. Leverage? What does that have to do with you? They came after her, Evan, he said bluntly. They threatened her, and when that didn't work, they threatened you. She didn't know what to do, so she called me. She thought I could help. Why you? I demanded. What did you have to do with any of this? Mark hesitated, the first crack in his composed facade. Because I owed them too, he admitted. Not as much as Eric, but enough to be on their radar. When Julia came to me, I thought maybe we could find a way out together. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. So what? You decided to betray me in the process. It wasn't like that, he insisted. We weren't involved, not the way you think. That night when you saw us, she was begging me to help her. I told her I'd try, but... He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the table. But what? I pressed. I panicked, he admitted. I realized I couldn't help her without risking myself. So I walked away. I left her to deal with it on her own. His words sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. You left her, I said incredulously. After everything, you just walked away? I wasn't a hero, Evan, he said bitterly. I was a coward, and I've regretted it every day since. I sat back, trying to process everything he'd said. The betrayal I'd carried for years suddenly felt different, complicated. Julia wasn't the villain I'd made her out to be. And Mark, he wasn't just a betrayer. He was a coward who had abandoned her when she needed him most. There's more, isn't there? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded. Yeah, he said. There's a lot more. And if Julia called you after all this time, it means it's not over. I left the bar with more questions than answers, my mind a swirling storm of anger, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. For 10 years, I'd carried the weight of betrayal, only to discover it was part of a larger, darker puzzle. Julia hadn't just made a mistake. She'd been caught in a web of danger I'd never even known existed. And Mark had left her there. The thought gnawed at me as I drove home. What had she gone through after I left? How had she survived? And if the danger wasn't over, what did that mean for her now, and for me? The next day, I couldn't focus on work. Emails went unanswered, phone calls ignored. My mind was consumed with piecing together the fragments of the story. Julia's mention of Eric, Mark's admission of his debts, the shadowy figures pulling the strings. It all felt like a half-finished jigsaw puzzle, the edges still blurred. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. Evan. Julia's voice was barely a whisper, shaky and urgent. Julia, I said, my heart quickening. What's going on? I think they've found me, she said, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I don't know how, but they know I've been trying to talk to you. My stomach dropped. Who? The same people who went after Eric. Yes, she said. I thought I was safe. I thought they'd forgotten about me. But I was wrong. Where are you? I demanded. I'm staying at a motel outside the city, she said. I didn't want to lead them to my place. But Evan, I'm scared. They're watching me. Her fear was palpable, and it cut through any lingering resentment I had. Whatever had happened between us, she was in danger now. And for some reason, she'd chosen to come to me. Stay where you are, I said. I'm coming to get you. The motel was as nondescript as they came. A peeling sign advertising low rates, flickering in the cold evening air. Julia was waiting in the lobby, her face pale and drawn. She flinched when the door opened, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Evan, she said, relief flooding her face as I walked in. Let's get out of here, I said, taking her by the arm. We'll figure out the rest later. As we drove, I noticed her hands trembling in her lap. Tell me everything, I said, glancing at her. From the beginning. She nodded, staring out the window as she spoke. After you left, I tried to deal with it on my own. Eric was gone. He disappeared not long after that night. I paid off what I could, but it was never enough. They kept coming back, demanding more. I thought they'd finally given up when I stopped hearing from them. But now, she trailed off, her voice breaking. Now what? I pressed. They sent a message, she said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. I unfolded it, my stomach turning as I read the words. You can't run forever. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about debts or mistakes. It was personal. Do you have any idea what they want now? I asked. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm afraid they won't stop until they get it. I didn't have a plan, didn't know how to fix this. But as I looked at her, the fear etched into her face. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't walk away this time. The silence in the car was heavy as I drove Julia to my apartment. I didn't know if bringing her there was a mistake. If her pursuers were truly watching, it might only paint a target on my back. But the thought of leaving her alone at that motel, vulnerable and terrified, wasn't an option. When we arrived, I double-checked the locks and drew the curtains tight. Julia paced the living room like a caged animal, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. I handed her a glass of water, which she barely sipped before setting it down. We need to figure out who they are and what they want, I said, sitting across from her. You said Eric disappeared. Did you ever try to find him? She shook her head. I didn't have the resources or the courage. After you left, I was barely keeping myself together. And then, he just became a ghost. Do you think he's still alive? I asked. She hesitated. I don't know. Part of me hopes he's gone, for his sake. If he's still alive, it means they're still after him too. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The possibility that Eric was out there, alive and on the run, added a new layer of complexity to the situation. If he was the source of the problem, finding him might be the only way to end it. I'm going to call someone, I said, reaching for my phone. Who? Julia asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. An old friend, I said. Detective Riley. He might be able to help us figure out who we're dealing with. Julia looked uneasy but didn't object. I dialed the number, and after a few rings, Riley picked up. Evan, he said, his gruff voice instantly familiar. Haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on? It's complicated, I said, but I need your help. Off the record. There was a pause. All right, what's the situation? I glanced at Julia, who was watching me intently. Do you remember Julia? Your ex-wife, Riley said, his tone immediately shifting. What about her? She's in trouble, I said. Some people are after her, dangerous people. I need to know who they are and why they won't leave her alone. Riley exhaled sharply. That's a tall order, Evan. You have anything to go on? Her brother, Eric, I said. He owed money to the wrong people. She thinks it's connected. Eric? Riley muttered, as if the name sparked a memory. Hold on a second. I heard him typing in the background, followed by a low whistle. Your ex's brother made quite a mess for himself. His name came up in a case a few years back, drug trafficking and racketeering. The people he was involved with aren't small-time, Evan. We're talking about the Solano cartel. The name hit me like a hammer. The Solano cartel was infamous, violent, relentless, and untouchable. If Julia and Eric had crossed them, it was no wonder she was terrified. Do you think Eric's still alive? I asked. Doubt it, Riley said. People who owe the Solanos don't usually live long enough to pay their debts. But if they're still coming after her, it means they think she has something they want. Like what? Money, information, or leverage, Riley said. You'd better be careful, Evan. These people don't play games. After I hung up, I relayed the information to Julia. Her face went pale. The Solano cartel, she whispered. I thought it was just a local gang. I didn't know it was them. Do you have anything of Eric's? I asked. Anything he might have left behind that could explain why they're still after you? She shook her head. I don't think so. He was always careful about keeping me out of his business. I stood and began pacing. There has to be something. Riley said they think you have leverage. What could they mean? Julia hesitated, biting her lip. There is one thing, she said finally. What? I asked, stopping in my tracks. Before Eric disappeared, he gave me a box, she said. He told me not to open it unless something happened to him. I didn't think it was important, so I hid it in my old apartment. Do you know if it's still there? I asked. I don't know, she said. But if they think I still have it, that might be why they're after me. Her words sent a chill through me. A mysterious box, a connection to one of the most dangerous cartels in the country, and a trail that had gone cold for years. Whatever was in that box, it might be the key to everything or the final nail in our coffins. The air felt heavy with tension as Julia and I sat in my apartment, contemplating our next move. The box she'd mentioned felt like Pandora's, filled with answers we desperately needed, but carrying the potential to unleash something far worse. We need to get it, I said finally, breaking the silence. Julia looked at me, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. Evan, if it's still there, it's been untouched for years. What if it's empty? Or worse, what if it's already been found? We won't know until we check, I said firmly. Where is it? She hesitated. In a storage space in the basement of my old apartment building. I hid it in the vent behind one of the lockers. It's not exactly secure, but I thought it was the last place anyone would look. And you're sure no one else knew about it? Positive, she said. Eric told me to keep it a secret. We agreed to go under cover of darkness. The less attention we drew, the better. As we drove to her old building, Julia grew increasingly quiet, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. I wanted to reassure her, but what could I say? That everything would be fine? Even I didn't believe that. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in 10 years. It still had the same grimy streets, the same flickering streetlights, the same air of quiet desperation. Julia directed me to a narrow alley that led to the building's rear entrance. I'll stay with the car, I said. If anything looks suspicious, call me, and we're out of here. She nodded, pulling her hoodie tighter around her face. I'll be quick. I watched as she slipped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the car, my eyes scanning the darkened street. Every shadow, every passing car set my nerves on edge. Finally, my phone buzzed. Julia's voice came through, low and urgent. I've got it. I'm coming out. Relief flooded through me as I saw her emerge, clutching a small, battered metal box to her chest. But the relief was short-lived. Stay low. I barked as a dark SUV roared into the alley, its headlights blinding. Julia froze, and before I could react, two men stepped out, their faces obscured by the glare. Run! I shouted, throwing open my door and sprinting toward her. One of the men lunged for Julia, but she darted to the side, clutching the box like her life depended on it. I tackled the man, knocking him to the ground, but the other was already closing in. Give us the box, he snarled, pulling a gun from his waistband. Evan! Julia screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. Time slowed. I saw the gun, saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground and swung it at his arm. The gun clattered to the pavement, and Julia seized the moment, kicking it out of reach. The first man scrambled to his feet, but before he could reach us, the wail of sirens filled the air. Someone had called the police. The men exchanged a look, then bolted back to their SUV, tires screeching as they disappeared into the night. Breathing heavily, I turned to Julia. Are you okay? She nodded, her face pale but determined. I still have it, she said, holding up the box. We didn't wait around for the cops. Back at my apartment, we locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight before sitting at the table with the box between us. It's time, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. Julia nodded, her hands trembling as she undid the latch. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of documents, a flash drive, and something that looked like a ledger. What is this? I asked, picking up the ledger. Julia scanned the pages, her eyes widening in horror. It's a record, she said. Transactions, names, dates. Eric was keeping track of everything. These people, their deals, their clients. It's all here. And the flash drive? She plugged it into my laptop, and we both stared at the screen as a series of files loaded. Videos, audio recordings, emails. It was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. This isn't just leverage, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This is a death sentence. For them, and for us. The documents were worse than I imagined. Names of high-profile officials, business tycoons, and even law enforcement officers, all tied to the Solano cartel. They had embedded themselves in every level of society, and Eric had been the one to keep track of it all. His betrayal was darker than I could have ever fathomed. Julia's face was ashen as she scrolled through the files. This is what they want. This is the leverage. I nodded grimly. If we give this to the authorities, we might be able to bring them down. But they'll come after us first. She looked at me, eyes full of fear. What do we do, Evan? We use it, I said. We play their game. We don't run. We fight. The hours stretched long into the night as Julia and I devised our plan. The evidence was damning, but handing it over to the wrong people could be as deadly as keeping it. We needed a strategy, an ally we could trust, someone who could protect us after everything was exposed. In the morning, I made the call to Riley. I didn't give him all the details, but I knew he was our best shot at surviving this. I'm bringing you something, I said, and when I do, you'll owe me. The drive to the police station felt like a one-way trip to the gallows. Julia's hand shook as she held the box, but there was no turning back. We arrived at Riley's office. His eyes flickered over the documents and the flash drive, and for the first time in years, I saw a man who wasn't just a cop but someone who understood the weight of what we were carrying. You sure about this? He asked. We don't have a choice, I replied. Riley took a deep breath and nodded. Then let's burn this cartel to the ground. Thank you for sticking with this story. What do you think about the choices Evan and Julia made? Was it worth the risk? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories.